welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Sean Field. He's a professor in history at the University of Vermont. Sean, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, AJ.
So today you're here to speak to us about Margherita Colonna. But before we get into her, tell us a little bit more about you. What areas of history are you most interested in, and how did you find your way from those into the realm of mysticism?
That's a great question. For the 25 years or so of my career, I've been a historian who's been interested in women in medieval Europe and the ways in which they were able to make their voices and their influence felt. So most often where religious power and political power intersect. And in studying that kind of dynamic, one of the ways, not the only way, of course, but one of the ways in which women who might otherwise have been easily passed over or ignored were able to insist on their voices being heard was by using what we might call a mystical or visionary voice. In other words, to say, I have had a direct, unmediated contact with God or with the Virgin Mary or with the saints. They've appeared to me. They have spoken to me. They have given me a message. And when I speak to you now, it's not really my voice at all. It's not really my words, my ideas. It is, in fact, God or the Virgin Mary or a saint who is speaking through me. So I wouldn't normally primarily identify myself as a historian of mysticism as such, more as a historian of medieval women. But that kind of visionary or mystical discourse is definitely one of the things that's so interesting about studying women in their medieval context.
Absolutely. Mysticism really is one of the areas where we hear women's voices of this period, and we hear them quite loudly.
Quite loudly and in many extraordinarily fascinating ways. It's a discourse that can lead, as you're saying, in many different directions and is endlessly interesting to study.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. So how did you find Margherita Colonna?
Right. So my doctoral research 25 years ago was on a different woman, a woman named Isabella of France, who was the sister of King Louis IX of France, so a 13th century woman. And Isabel was not a mystic. Isabel is a saintly woman, a fascinating woman. She is most influential and most important as the founder of an abbey for Franciscan women in the French royal orbit near Paris, and as the author of a rule for that distinct branch of female Franciscanism, a rule for the sorores minores, or the sisters minor. So as I was working on Isabel for years, and I continue to work on Isabel, one of the things that's interested me is that particular branch of female Franciscan family. The other thing that was so interesting about Isabel is that her contemporary biography was written about her by a woman who knew her very well, a woman named Agnes of Harcourt. And so another strand of what I've worked on over the years is women as hagiographers, women who wrote saints' lives about other women. So all of this is as a way of saying that the themes that I've followed out over the last quarter century have all tended to spring from this early research, women in the Franciscan order, political and religious power at the French royal court, and women as hagiographers. So all of that helps to explain why for a long time I had Margherita Colonna in the back of my mind and on my radar as someone I'd like to study more closely, because we'll get into the details of her biography in a moment, I think. But after she died, the group of women who'd gathered around her ultimately formed a female Franciscan house that adopted the rule of the sorores minores, the rule that Isabella of France had written, which was quite unusual in the Italian context. And so I was curious about how did that happen. And also because we know about Margherita Colonna because of the two lives that were written about her shortly after her death, one by her own brother, Giovanni Colonna, and the other by a woman named Stefania. So this is one of the relatively rare places in the 13th century where we do find a woman writing a hagiographical text about another woman at almost exactly the same time that Agnes of Harcourt was writing. And so there are a number of themes and strands and ties that had caused me to want to look more closely at Margherita Colonna's life and at the texts about her. So eventually I got together with Leslie Knox, who's a professor at Marquette University and knows a bit more than I do about the political context in Rome, and with Larry Field, who is my father and who is a retired professor. And we worked up an English translation of these two lives and associated texts of Margherita Colonna and published it in a book called Visions of Sainthood in Medieval Rome a few years back with University of Notre Dame Press. and tried to get to the bottom of what these texts were all about and understand Margherita and her world a little bit better.
So actually, before we get into the details of her life, let's talk a little bit more about her hagiography, because hers is a really interesting case where we have two different lives written by two different people nearly contemporaneously, one of which was written by her brother and the other was written by a member of her religious community. So can you tell us a little bit about these two different lives and maybe some of the differences between them?
Yeah, so this is for sure one of the most interesting things about Margherita Colonna's life and her context. So Margherita died at the very end of 1280, and within the next couple of years, her brother Giovanni wrote the first Vita, the first saint's life about her. It's written in Latin. It's written in a quirky, idiosyncratic Latin because Giovanni, he was her biological brother, and he had been senator of Rome. He's a very powerful man, but he is not a churchman. He's a secular figure. Very unusual to have a secular figure writing a saint's life, and even more unusual to have a powerful non-churchman write the saint's life about his own biological sister. It's a very unique dynamic. And Stefania is a bit of a mystery. She gives her name clearly. We know her name is Stefania. Everything else is a bit of a deduction of who she must have been. She says that she is writing from the position as leader of this community, this successor community based on Margherita's followers. So she could have been an abbess of the Franciscan community that was formed around Margherita's followers, but there's no archival evidence to show that she was. She could have sort of informally been saying, I'm one of the senior leaders of this group. It's quite possible that she was also a member of the Colonna family, maybe a cousin or just possibly maybe a younger sister of Margherita Colonna herself. She clearly is an insider. She clearly has easy access to both Giovanni and Margherita's other brother, whose name was Giacomo, who was a cardinal of the church. She's clearly part of their inner circle. So there's a really interesting dynamic there to see how Margherita's powerful brother wants to present her and put her in the context of the Colonna family and their goals and what they want people to remember and understand about their saintly sister. And how this woman, Stefania, who wants to present more the women's perspective, the community, how they remember their founder, how they want to preserve her memory and her spirituality and what's important about her. And the two texts are very definitely complementary to each other. Stefania never says, oh, Giovanni, you got something wrong. But very subtly, she very definitely does try to correct the record to get her perspective in there.
That's really interesting. Can you give us some examples?
Okay, let me give you one very clear example, and this then gets into some visionary discourse and some mystical discourse, I guess. Giovanni Colonna mentions fairly briefly that Margherita had a vision of 3 roads. And his little description is not all that detailed or exciting. It's a vision in which she sees 3 different paths, and he says that she took the middle of these 3 roads to salvation. And he places the entire description of this miracle in the context of the last months of Margherita's life when she was suffering from a very painful and rather gruesome ulcer or open wound in her leg. This seems to have been what she died of at the young age of 25. She may have been suffering from some kind of bone cancer or something particularly nasty and gruesome, which is described in a great deal of detail. And Giovanni describes this vision as saying that she saw that she would, quote, have to go through blood. And he describes all of the bleeding and the suffering of her body and makes the point of the vision to be that Margherita, at the end of her life, understood she would have to suffer physically in her body before reaching salvation. When Stefania comes back to this same vision, without ever saying, Giovanni didn't understand this or he got the details wrong, she just tacitly corrects him. And she gives more detail and says that, in fact, Margherita saw herself on the 3rd path, not the middle path, but the 3rd path, where she would, quote, fly like a pure dove to Christ. So for Stefania, Margherita gets to basically fly over all the difficulties of the world because of her spiritual purity and arrive at a much more interior and spiritual path to salvation. The vision itself is not really about bodily suffering for Stefania. So this is one of the most direct places where you can see them giving competing interpretations of the same vision. It's in line with what some scholars like Amy Hollywood have argued about male hagiographers being more interested in inscribing sanctity on women's bodies, using women's bodies to show how suffering proves their sanctity, and female authors maybe being less interested in that kind of dynamic. It's a very graphic example of that. And it's also Stefania clearly laying her claim to say that we, the community of women around her, we actually know a little bit better than you do, Giovanni, what was really in her mind and how she understood the meaning of her own vision. So it's really a fascinating example.
So was Giovanni himself in a religious order, or was he just thinking, hey, you know what this family needs? A saint. Let me go ahead and write this stuff down.
Yeah, exactly. So Margherita had a fairly large family with a number of siblings, but the most important are Giovanni, who is her oldest brother, and who is not a member of any religious order. He's not a priest, he's not a monk, he's not a friar. He is a layman with a family who serves as senator of Rome and in other important secular positions. The other important brother is Giacomo, who is a churchman. He is appointed cardinal in the late 1270s, and you really would expect that it would be he who would have written the saint's life of his sister. He clearly is her important spiritual advisor, and they form a kind of a spiritual sibling pair as well as a biological sibling pair. But in fact, it's Giovanni who actually writes the life, and although I wouldn't put it too cynically, I do think he actually was deeply impressed in the end with his sister's spirituality and her life. There's no doubt whatsoever that in writing this life, he is trying to make the claim that the Colonna family has had a living saint amongst them, and now after her death, that she is in fact worthy of sainthood and canonization. And that's the dynamic that this very powerful, very ambitious family is trying to push. And it's not even really some kind of like subtext to the Vita. It's pretty much right out there in the open. And in fact, Stefania tells a miracle, which again, this is this very subtle kind of jockeying between the two texts. Stefania tells about this miracle where there's a man who is suffering from an illness and he's trying to find a doctor, but the doctor has gone with the Colonna brothers up to their family compound where Margherita's body is buried. And the man suffering from the illness says, how do you like that? It's so embarrassing the way the Colonna are trying to force their sister into the choir of the saints. And the man's wife chastises him and says, you have to be more pious than that. And in the end, he realizes he was quite wrong to criticize the idea that Margherita was a saint. And of course, he's cured. But it's Stefania putting this right into the text and basically showing that people around the area were completely aware of what the Colonna were doing. And she's trying to quell that sort of dissent and say, see what happens when you doubt the motives of the Colonna family here. In the end, you'll come around to understanding that this is all really very pious.
I kind of love it when the desperation for the figure to be a saint is just right there out front in the open. We think she's a saint and we're going to make sure you do too. It's great. Don't make me figure out your motives. Just state them plainly. It's wonderful.
Exactly. And one of the reasons why these texts are so fascinating and fun to read is that although these are two intelligent and educated authors, neither one is, a university master or a really polished author. These are somewhat clunky texts that they really function as long strings of visions that are just put together with commentary. And they don't quite have the polish that you would get from some of the 13th or 14th century saints' lives that have really been done by, experienced hagiographers or churchmen who know exactly what's needed for canonization progress. You can really see the seams showing in these texts, which is, makes them really interesting to analyze.
Okay, so let's move on now to what we get from these texts, which is Margherita's life. Who was she? What do we know about her?
Yeah, the basic facts of her biography are pretty straightforward. So she was born about 1255, and as I said, only lived to the age of about 25. Her date of death is very clearly established as the 30th of December, 1280. So as we've already been suggesting, she's from the Colonna family, which is among the very most powerful families in 13th century Rome. Her father had already been senator of Rome. I've mentioned that her older brother Giovanni is senator. I've mentioned that her other brother Giacomo is a cardinal. Her mother actually was from the Orsini family, which is probably the other most important family in Rome. So Margherita is connected to everybody. So for instance, her first cousin Gian Gaetano Orsini becomes Pope Nicholas III I think it's in 1278. So that's how her brother is appointed as a cardinal. Like, this is a family with their fingers in all the political and religious pies. They are connected to everybody. You really could not be in a more powerful family in the middle of 13th century Rome. So after her father and her mother both die, Margherita is under the authority of her older brother Giovanni, who of course was trying to arrange a marriage for her, but by the time she was about 18 years old or so. And she refuses to get married, strikes out on a path of holy virginity, and has the support of her other brother, Giacomo, the cardinal, in that decision. She gathers some women around her and at first is living on Mount Prenestino, which is just outside Rome. It's near Palestrina. And this is basically the Colonna stronghold. This is where their family really controls this countryside and this mountaintop. And she gathers women around her to live an informal religious life. She's clearly influenced by Francis, by Clare. She's in a Franciscan context, but she is also clearly not interested in becoming a Franciscan nun, a member of the Order of St. Clare. And this is one of the tensions running through Giovanni's text, is the way he describes it. She was waiting for her family to build her a monastery. She would have been willing to become a nun if they had built her a new monastery, but they never managed to get it done, and so she doesn't become a nun. It actually seems pretty clear to me that she never wanted to be a nun in the first place. So they encourage her to perhaps go to Assisi and join the house of Santa Chiara there, but she doesn't. And eventually she leaves the mountaintop where she'd settled and takes her followers and goes to another nearby community at Mentorella. And she and her followers are kicked out of this little church that they tried to inhabit because the local political powers there probably didn't like the idea that the Colonna were encroaching on their little mountaintop, fortress. They're like, go back to Mount Prenestino where you came from. She then goes down into the city of Rome and spends some time living with an otherwise unknown woman, but a figure sounds absolutely fascinating, who in the text is called Lady Altruda of the Poor. And she just moves into her little household, does her household tasks for her, her menial tasks, the sweeping, the cleaning, the cooking, and spends time, in spite of her exalted status as daughter of the colonial family, she's living as this domestic servant for this woman before eventually coming back when her brothers put pressure on her, and she comes back and settles down again up on top of Mount Prenestino. But still, this is a life caring for the poor, out in the streets of Rome, doing charitable work, caring for the sick, the needy, lepers, using the money at her disposal because of her wealthy family to help people in Rome who need it. So that kind of unenclosed religious life that we see in a number of 13th century women influenced by Francis, that is controversial. It's hard for the church to accept. It's not all that clear on the part of her family whether they're happy about this. But she dies at a young age, as I've said several times, and in a sense, that resolves the entire problem. Once she's dead, I'm sure her brothers were very sorry that she died, and they seem to have been very, very attached to her. But now that whole question of what do we do with our younger sister, Margherita, like how do we solve this problem? That's no longer the issue, and the issue becomes, how do we represent her? Like, how do we make the claim that she had been a saint? She wasn't a problem. She wasn't a controversy. All those doubts we had about her, let's forget those and let's find a way to frame her life so that we could present perhaps the papacy with the case to begin canonization hearings, or at least, promote her reputation in Rome and make our family reputation a little stronger. So that's the context then in which Giovanni first writes First Life, and then it seems as though Giacomo, the cardinal, asks Stefania to chip in and bring some more of her memories to the table. And as I've said, both texts are just filled with visions, not only Margherita's own visions, but every one of these texts has visions. Giovanni has visions, Giacomo has visions, Stefania has visions. Every point that's made is permeated with some kind of vision to show what God or the Virgin Mary thinks about the issue.
That is so interesting. I think sometimes we focus a little bit too much on the idea of visions as being the thing that singles out these mystics as being particularly holy, as making them worthy of canonization, as marking them out as a saint. But at other times, visionary experience seems to proliferate, and it seems like anyone could have these kind of experiences, and it's not those that make the mystic special.
Yeah, and everybody does have them, apparently, at least in this world. It's not unusual. It's the fact that she has visions is not what marks Margherita out as a saint. It's the content of all of the vision that's centered around Margherita that, makes her the center of this story. But it's not because she's the only one having visions.
Exactly. So let's get into the content then. What kind of things does she have visions about? Is there a theme? Is there a purpose to these experiences? What kind of roles are these visions playing?
Yeah. In the case of these texts, all kinds of different purposes seem to be served by these visions. Maybe the most obvious and, not particularly unexpected is to validate her own decisions, the things that she does that are controversial. So, for instance, the beginning of the text is set up around the beginning of Giovanni's text, that the tension is around whether she will get married or not. And remember, it's Giovanni writing the text, and in real life, he is the brother who is trying to arrange her marriage. So the time he's writing after her death, essentially he's been on the wrong side of this question. If she's going to present the context that she was a saint, then of course it's going to prove the case in the end that she should not have followed his advice and gotten married. So the very first vision in the text is not Margherita, it's Giacomo, it's the cardinal. He is off in Bologna. He knows his sister doesn't want to get married, but this is all still hanging in the balance at this time. And he sees a vision where he sees Margherita being carried up into the air by two angels. And it's sort of comical. He describes it as though he sees these angels and then they go behind a house. So he goes running through the house. He goes running out the front door to see whether they're still there. So this tells him that, in fact, God definitely does want Margherita to be carried away from the secular world and to pursue this spiritual path. And then we see Margherita's own vision. We're sure about what she wants, but we're not sure whether God approves of what she wants. And she has a vision where the Virgin Mary appears to her. Margherita is in bed, and the Virgin Mary appears riding a chariot. It's a great image. And the Virgin Mary tells her, you will get your heart's desire, and I will be here for you. And then the text says the image is so brilliant and fiery, like visually she can't take it. So she rolls over in bed and turns away to the other side of the bed from where the Virgin Mary in her chariot is. And the Virgin Mary in her chariot scurries around to the other side of the bed so that she's back in her face and continues to reassure her. And I love this vision because it's not so much that it's comical, though it, in a short version, it almost sounds sort of funny, but it's again an example of a little bit of the clunkiness of it. Because at the end of the chapter, then Giovanni has to explain that we shouldn't hold it against Margherita that she turned away from the Virgin Mary, even though that might seem rude. But she had no choice because of, the splendor that was in her face. And it gives you this sense that he really did hear this story from Margherita in all its sort of awkwardness. And he really did record it as best he could in the way that she told it. And then he tried to explain it afterwards, rather than the other option would have been to just edit that out or to just kind of change it so that it was a more bland story. But he does seem to have done his best to tell us what his sister told him she had experienced. And I love that the end of the vision says she saw the Virgin Mary leaving and she caught a last glimpse of the undercarriage of the chariot heading off. It's almost sort of like Santa Claus heading out, or like those scenes in Star Wars where you see the Star Destroyer going overhead and you see under the ship with the big jet propulsion engines in the back there. I picture the Virgin Mary like zipping away on her chariot. And then finally, to finish this whole sequence, eventually then Giovanni has his own vision where he realizes that his continued attempts to try to get his sister to get married are not going to work out and not in accord with what God wants. And he has this vision where he's actually threatened by a man with a club who says, if you keep coming after my treasure here, meaning Margherita, I'm going to whack you with this club. So these three visions all together show how all three siblings eventually come to the understanding that God and the Virgin Mary support Margherita's decision not to marry.
Okay, so angels will hide from you behind a house, the Virgin Mary will get in your face and refuse to be ignored, and Christ is going to kill his opponents with a club.
Yes, I'm not sure that the actual last figure was supposed to be Christ, but somebody who is defending Margherita will physically assault you if you do not cease and desist.
So this vision then is obviously defending Margherita's own ability to choose what she wants to do with her own life. Props to her, absolutely. But what are the other visions doing?
Some of them are very clear. It's not all that complicated to analyze what purpose these visions serve, probably in Margherita's own life and then in the text. Some of them are just kind of cute and interesting. There's one I love where Margherita sees Jesus as a young boy about 3 years old, and he's lying on a bed, and somehow he is taking up the entire bed, even though he's a 3-year-old boy in this vision. So you wouldn't think a 3-year-old boy would take up the entire bed. maybe it was a very small bed. I'm not sure.
I mean, I've had a 3-year-old in my bed. This is not that unrealistic. They take up space.
Okay, good point. All right, I take it back. But I think you'll really like the rest of this vision then. So there's the 3-year-old Jesus taking up the whole bed, and the Virgin Mary is standing by. And Marguerite tries to shove little boy Jesus over on the bed to make room for the Virgin Mary. And she cannot move him. The text says it's as though she had wanted to push a mountain into a valley. I love that image. Like it's just impossible to move this little boy Jesus. So after a little while, she gets up her courage and she says, remember that she, the Virgin, remember that she carried you in her womb for our sake. And then little baby Jesus feels bad and he moves over and makes room for the Virgin. So I love this image. It doesn't have as clear a polemical purpose in the text, but this is Margherita repaying the favor with the Virgin Mary. Thanks for your support, and let me see if I can intervene here with your son, who, like all 3-year-old boys, can be a little bit self-centered when he doesn't think about what his mom needs, too, sometimes.
I really love that image of, please remember the mother, please remember what she has given us. Is Marian devotion a central theme in the text?
Yeah, indeed. And the visions in the text certainly do involve Jesus, but a lot of them involve the Virgin Mary, and that there's a lot to be unpacked there if you want to analyze these texts specifically for the image of the Virgin, maybe how the male author or some of the male commentators are reporting the role of the Virgin versus the way the Virgin is portrayed in Stefania's text. And for sure, that's one of the things that runs right through all of these texts in really interesting ways.
The role of the Virgin Mary, and really any individual saints in these texts, is always really fascinating. And that sounds like a very enticing perspective project for someone out there. If anyone's looking for something to sink their teeth into, that could be very good. Back to Margherita. Do we know much about her daily life, or is the work more focused on the recording of these particular visionary experiences?
They definitely do try to give at least a picture of her day-to-day life. And that is very much that life of her being most interested in caring for the poor, using the financial resources that were at her disposal to help those in need. So it's not exactly the Franciscan ideal of her living in complete poverty. She lives in poverty compared to the kind of life of luxury she could have lived had she married a Roman nobleman. She definitely lives that simple apostolic life, but she doesn't want to free herself from all access to funds because she wants to be able to help the poor and the needy and the sick with the funds at her disposal. So the descriptions of her daily life are definitely of her going out into the street to help people who need care, and also welcoming the poor into her informal community so that they can be fed, so that they can be cared for. For scholars who might be interested in the ways in which women play roles as informal healers and doctors, she definitely is credited here with understanding how to create remedies to help the sick, to having a kind of a somewhat intuitive but basic medical knowledge to recognize what people need. If somebody has a fever, what can she bring them, that sort of thing. So she's definitely living that kind of daily life. This is not an enclosed nun going through a round of liturgical worship during the day. This is a woman who is thinking about helping lepers, helping the poor, helping the sick. That's the day-to-day kind of basis for her claims to sanctity in addition to the visionary aspect.
So again, very Franciscan, out, active in the world.
Yeah, there's no doubt that she is inspired primarily from a Franciscan context. This is true for her wider family. They very definitely associate themselves with patronage of the Franciscans. Giacomo is not a member of the Franciscan order, but he is certainly known historically as a strong supporter of the Franciscans. And several of the visions do mention Francis specifically. They mention Clare of Assisi specifically. There are Franciscan friars on the edges of all of these contexts and visions. Several Franciscan friars after Margherita's death also report visions of seeing her in heaven as part of a lineup of other, female saints, confirming, that's her status in the next world. So for sure, for anyone who's interested in women on the margins of the Franciscan order, this is definitely a very interesting place to find another example of these kind of women like Angelo Foligno, like Margherita of Cortona, probably some other mystics that have also appeared on your podcast, I'm sure. It's a fascinating place to get some depth on exactly how these kind of women negotiated this Franciscan influence without actually joining the Order of St. Clare.
Which I almost think, and this is personal bias, is almost more reflective of St. Francis, because he didn't seem like he really wanted to be part of an order either. Didn't necessarily want to be an official anything. But you do what you gotta do. And so these women who want to live a Franciscan way of life without becoming a nun, do what you want. That sounds wonderful.
Indeed, you could certainly make the case that Margherita is very strongly following Francis's own influence more directly, say, than Clare's, though she clearly has Clare in her mind as well. And that for the brief period, it's only 7 or 8 years between the time she fights off this proposed marriage and her death, she really is living a life not that far from what Francis did and what Francis wanted. And of course, it's also true, however you want to frame this, that after her death, the women who had been gathered around her do end up forming a more traditional and closed Franciscan nunnery, even if it's part of the Order of Sorores Minores, not the Order of St. Clare. Because clearly once Margherita is gone, this is the direction that her brothers want to push these women, and they do everything that's necessary and everything possible to get support from the Franciscan order, from the papacy, and to move them into what had been an established Benedictine monastery of San Silvestro and Capite in the Colonna neighborhood in Rome, so that really comes directly under their family influence. So there's a fairly brief period where Margherita and her followers are allowed to really live this controversial, audacious, out in the streets Franciscan kind of life, and then somewhat inevitably, as it gets into the next generation, they're encouraged to settle down in a less controversial form.
I mean, no shade to Clare, obviously, because the same thing happened to her. She wanted to live a life of apostolic poverty, and she just kept getting told, no, you're a woman, go inside. So she made it work.
Indeed, different kinds of negotiations, with similar kinds of ideals in mind.
So do we know much about what happened to Margherita's community after she died?
One of the fascinating little tags about Margherita's memory and her followers is that at the very end of the 13th century, the Colonna family got into a battle to the death with Pope Boniface VIII. And Boniface VIII was trying to destroy their power, destroy their holdings. He removes the Colonna from all their positions and holdings and strips Giacomo of his cardinalate. And the community of Margherita's followers gets wrapped up in this as well. So the abbess had been Giovanni's daughter, Giovanna, and she's stripped of her position as abbess. And this is a ruthless, ruthless battle. Anything that can be used to attack the Colonna is being used. And so it probably helps to explain why the attempts at her canonization don't go anywhere and why her memory seems to have been temporarily effaced is, rather than having support from the papacy, very quickly it's the exact opposite, so that her memory gets caught up in this vicious battle, and the Colonna have more immediate and more important things to do around 1300 than to continue to push her canonization.
The impact of family political situations on sanctity is amazing in this period. It really shows the interconnections between religion and politics and how they're so intrinsically intertwined. I mean, you either get to become a saint because of nepotism, or you don't because your family got in a fight with a pope. We are unfortunately now coming towards the end of the podcast, which means I just have to ask you the one big question, which is, why is Margherita Colonna your favorite mystic?
Well, I would sum that up as saying that she lived a short life, and every aspect of it was controversial. She was, in fact, a rebel, maybe a saintly version of live fast, die young. Sometimes when I've assigned this text to students, their initial impulse is to think that she was this very obedient girl because they see piety and they see her being described in a saint's life as this wonderful figure. And they say, oh, she, must have just done everything she was supposed to. But it's the exact opposite. She never did anything she was supposed to. And it's only after she's safely dead that her memory is being controlled and put into a framework that works. But if you read through that and read what she actually did in her very short career, She continually refuses to do what's expected of her. And I find that a fascinating model of sanctity and a fairly inspiring figure of somebody who was very, very clear about what she thought God wanted her to do and was uncompromising about it. And maybe precisely because she didn't live a very long life, never really had to compromise very clearly and was able to really fully embrace the ideals that she thought were inherent in what God had intended for her.
She sounds amazing, and I adore the idea of piety not necessarily meaning doing exactly what you're told, but instead fighting for what you think God wants you to do, and never mind what your family wants, because he's not talking to them.
Yeah, a teenage rebel for the 13th century.
Perfect. Tagline of the episode found just at the very end. And Sean, thank you so much for joining me today and for telling me all about Margherita Colonna.
Thanks for having me, AJ.
And thank you all for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic, and join me next time when I speak to Ilona Gerbacher about Moses Maimonides.